In this lecture video, I'm going to be presenting Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Burke is a seminal figure in the history of Western political philosophy and is credited for being the father of conservatism. What we'll see in the reflections is his critique of the French Revolution, not merely its means, right, the actions, the course it took, but also the ideals which it was inspired by, that being liberalism. But before we look actually at his critique of the French Revolution, we have to have a better sense of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a pivotal moment in the political history of Western political philosophy, of Western politics, of liberalism. It is the French Revolution that sought to, in the most dramatic way, overthrow the Ancien regime, the way of the old order, I guess, so to speak, and realize the ideals of liberalism, of chiefly liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolution lasted roughly 1788 to 1799. So, quickly to understand the context of the revolution, the French government was divided up. So it was technically a constitutional monarchy, but really it was a monarch with absolute rule. There were technically these estates, which were divided up among all the French people into three kind of bodies that determined the legal rights and status of people. And you had of the estates, the nobles, the clergy or the priests, and then the majority of the people were represented, by the public in what was known as the third estate. So first would have been the religious, second nobles, and third the commoners. So serfdom still largely existed in France at this time. Government was deemed legitimate. The rule of the monarch was deemed legitimate by that notion of the divine right of kings. And it was this system then that stood as a stark contrast to the ideals and the philosophy of liberalism. So you can see here the three estates, right? The first estate represented about 1% of the population, and they ended up owning 10% of the land. The nobles represented about 2% of the population, and they owned 25% of the land. So imagine, right, you have a kind of Congress and you need majority to determine whether something passes or not, what the legislation is, what the bills will be. Well, look at that. The clergy and nobles can obviously, if they're divided up into three, well, the clergy and nobles represent a majority, even though they only represent about 3% of the population. The third estate represented basically the middle class peasants and city workers, where about 97% of the people owned 65% of the land. And when we say owned, it wasn't exactly like they were, owners of private property in a sense we might think of now. They worked the land. They were tied to the land, most of them, as serfs. So what were the material reasons that led to the falling apart of the Ancien regime that led to and prompted the French Revolution? Well, you have financial problems. So two big reasons: taxes, that, well, the peasants pay most of the taxes, and the nobility and clergy are largely exempt. So you can imagine a strain on the majority of people. And you also have debt, where the French government gave $6 million to the American colonists to fight against England in the Revolutionary War. You had 50% of the national budget paid for loans to fight England, 25% paid for military expenditures, another 6% paid for parties, including clothing and expensive lifestyle of the king. So there's not a whole lot left to actually do anything domestically that provides, for any of the majority of the people. You also had crop failure, which led to starvation. Well, the government is in so much debt, they can't really do much. And if they want to raise funds, they're going to be taxing the very people that are hurting the most. So you had, so for over 100 years, the National Assembly, the three estates hadn't actually met. They were disbanded. What happened was they met on the tennis court and took the tennis court oath. That is the third assembly, the third estate did. So they took this oath to vow to not leave until they wrote a new constitution for France because the government was failing. Well, if you only have one body, the third estate in Congress, they can determine whatever they want. So the king ordered the first and second estate to join the National Assembly because he feared of what the third estate by themselves might accomplish, because without the first and second estate there, the third estate now had the majority of votes. So what did he do? What did King Louis XVI do? Gathered troops for his protection, which made people think he's actually then going to break up the National Assembly. So you can see there's a lot of suspicion here. Nobody trusts the government. The government doesn't trust the majority of the people who are supposed to be his citizens, his subjects. So they draw up the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, which is a part of the French Constitution today. So its purpose was to establish equality in France and abolish the class system. It incorporated Enlightenment ideas, such as Montesquieu's ideas of separation of powers, Rousseau's belief in the will of the majority, Locke's belief in natural rights, and Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. What happened when this was taken to King Louis XVI? He rejected the Declaration. So just a closer look at the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It's centered on the idea of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press. It guaranteed property rights. It was centered around the motto, liberty, equality, fraternity. The idea of the right of the people to create laws and a right to a fair trial. There was also, after the Declaration of the Rights of Man was written, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman. So the journalist Olympe de Gouges argued in her Declaration of the Rights of Woman that women are equal citizens and should benefit from governmental reforms just as men did, right? So all those rights of the Declaration of the Rights of Men should also apply to women. You had Madame Jeanne Roland also served as a leader in the women's rights movement and was able to heavily influence her husband, who was a government official, according to the Declaration of the Rights of Women. So women did gain some rights during the French Revolution, but these were designed for purposes other than liberating women. So women could inherit property, but only because doing so weakened feudalism and reduced wealth among the upper classes. Divorce became easier, but only to weaken the church's control over marriage. So while we can see the kind of rights women gained, they weren't full rights, and they weren't entirely in the spirit of the liberalism of the French Revolution. So, what actually occurred in the French Revolution? You had the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, where people thought that this is where a bunch of political prisoners were being held. It turned out, actually, when they went in there were only a couple people, most of whom weren't actually political prisoners. But nonetheless, it had already happened. The Bastille had been stormed, marking the beginning of the French Revolution in many ways, like July 4th for the United States. So the third estate, they storm in the jail and let prisoners out. In 1791, a constitution was drawn up, which made France a constitutional monarchy. It now had a unicameral legislature, meaning one house, right, called the National Convention. The king was to serve as the executive of the National Convention. Everyone, all the citizens were to be equal. All legislators getting a vote in the National Convention. Delegates then were seated by their political beliefs, not by their class, which, in the United States, you can see now, typically Democrats sit together, Republicans sit together, and so on. So you basically had the decline of the monarchy starting around, well, it had already started, but really around 1792, where the Jacobins, or we'll just say Jacobins, the Jacobins wanted to create a republic. They didn't want a constitutional monarchy. They wanted to go further and fully realize the ideals of liberalism. So you had Louis XVI, who then was tried before the convention and convicted of conspiring against the liberty of the nation. He, as well as Marie Antoinette, was executed by the guillotine. If you want a nice depiction maybe of this and a story about that, there's the video recently of the metal band Gojira performing at the opening of the recent Olympics in Paris, which I thought was pretty awesome. I like Gojira. Well, what happens after Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are executed? Well, Austria and Prussia, also who were the Ancien regime, the old way of doing things, the old order, where serfdom still reigned, they declared war on France because they were fearful of the revolution spreading to Austria. So after the king and queen are executed, church lands were seized. They were divided and sold to peasants because there was no justification for this kind of land being given to churches where it was tax exempt, where they're given some of the best land. Instead, right, the point of the land is to be for the people. You had a civil constitution of the clergy that required that church officials be elected by the people with salaries paid by the government. You had 2/3 of church officials who ended up fleeing the country instead of swear allegiance to this. All feudal dues and tithes were eradicated. All special privileges of the first and second estates were abolished. Everyone was to be an equal before the government. So a few more reforms that were passed by the convention. You had the adopting of the metric system. You basically, feudalism was dealt the final blow by abolishing primogeniture, the system whereby the oldest son inherited all of his father's estate. They drew up a comprehensive system of laws. So they weren't going to be arbitrary laws passed whenever the king thought they should be passed, right? So you can see the kind of move towards a rational system of government as opposed to ultimately an arbitrary one. They ended debt imprisonment. So you couldn't just be sent to jail if you had debt, which of course, right? It's regressive. It punishes poor people the most. They ended slavery in France's colonies, and they established a nationwide system of public education. Education is to be a right for all and not only the rich. However, when revolutions occur, of course, there are many, the powerful, who want to stop them. This leads to a lot of anxiety and suspicion and conspiracy theories among those who were leading the revolution. So one of the leaders of the Jacobin movement, Robespierre, who wanted to change, again, France from a limited monarchy to a republic, he ends up executing anyone related to the monarchy. He executed roughly 40,000 people, most of whom ended up actually being commoners. Well, what happened? This reign of terror, you had everyone so suspicious. They're basically turning on each other. Well, they end up being fearful of Robespierre, and he ends up being killed by the guillotine as well, because others were afraid he was going to kill them. You had during this reign of terror a neighborhood watch where they hunted down suspected traitors and turned them over to the courts. You had basically neighbor turn on neighbor. Many of the people were innocent and yet executed. Why? Because nobody could trust anyone anymore. Kind of the social order had broken down. What happened? Well, when there is this kind of social chaos, there's always a turn to someone who can save them, who can save the people. You had a new constitution that was written up, a two-house legislature. You had a 5-man executive committee. Power was more divided because, well, with power concentrated in the hands of one or a few, they were able to easily round up a bunch of people and execute them. So they wanted a more decentralized form of government. The problem is this government couldn't make a lot of decisions. There was so much debate, but nothing accomplished. You had a growing gap between rich and poor then continue because nothing was being done about that, which led to dissatisfaction among the public. The French people looked for leadership. And who would they find? Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, a popular Napoleon launched a coup d'etat, an overthrow of the government, a change of government, change of state, literally, which ended this weak form of government. Napoleon becomes victorious, seizes control of France as a consul. Ultimately, he becomes dictator of France, and in 1799, the French Revolution comes to an end. Now, Napoleon becomes known later as the benevolent dictator because he did try to continue remaking France in the image and according to the ideals of liberalism. He made sure that serfdom was abolished. When he invaded Prussia and Austria and so on, he overthrew serfdom as well. Nonetheless, he was a dictator. Liberalism is founded on the idea that government should be founded on rational principles alone, right? It's the overthrowing of the idea of the divine right of kings, that a government must be legitimate. It must be justifiable to those over whom it rules. And liberalism seeks normative arguments as to when, right, that when a government is justified and how society ought to be constructed according to these principles, most notably this idea of rights and liberty. Burke is skeptical, though. He actually wrote an essay trying to show the extent to which reason can be used to argue all kinds of things which we would agree are ridiculous. He doesn't think that we can just use reason for practical necessities, and government for Burke is a practical necessity. Rights for Burke, they come from God. They do not come from people. We cannot merely use reason to try and figure out what, deductively or inductively, what is the most rational conception of rights, and then try to build, using reason, that in reality. Because since government is a practical necessity, then politics is practically experimental. Politics is a matter of trying things, seeing if they work or don't work, why they worked, and so on. It involves, practical judgment. It is not something that can be taught a priori. You cannot simply use reason to try and determine, okay, when is a government justified in this use of power and when is it not justified in the use of power? Because there is always going to be a certain kind of an exception that arises that requires a political actor to make a decision. You cannot account for everything in the world because the world is messy. The world is constantly changing. And humans are not gods, right? Our ability to use reason is also fallible. Burke says, what is the use of discussing a man's abstract right to food or medicine? The question is upon the method of procuring and administering them. In that deliberation, I shall always advise to call in the aid of the farmer and the physician rather than the professor of metaphysics. So Burke is saying, look, what's the point of trying to theorize, what are the extent to which we can say that everyone has a right to food and then develop some kind of a principle by which then we want to try and work out how we can apply that principle. Burke says, if I want to know about food, I'll go talk to the farmer. I'll go talk to the grocer. I'll go talk to the people that actually are involved in growing food, distributing food, cooking food, and so on. I'm not going to talk to some kind of philosopher who's just going to think about these things. He also says, the pretended rights of these theorists are all extremes, and in proportion as they are metaphysically true, they are morally and politically false. So he's saying, look, he might be able to construct some theory of government, some theory of rights, which is logical, but that doesn't mean is normative. It doesn't mean we ought to abide by them, follow them, and be bound by them. The rights of men are in a sort of middle. They're incapable of definition, but they're not impossible to be discerned, right? So if rights are given by God, then we can try to figure out to what extent they are alienable, right? Now, there, as it was said in the U.S. context, right, there are inalienable rights. There are also innumerable rights, so we ought to enumerate what those are. But that doesn't mean they all can be. The rights of men and governments are their advantages, and these are often sometimes imbalances between differences of good, and compromises between good and evil, and sometimes between evil and evil. Right? Here he's appealing to political actors when they have to make tough choices. It's easy for a philosopher to sit there and think about, how a government ought to function, how a ruler, when they are justified to act and when they are not. But what about when you're pitted in some of these circumstances? This is something that actually modern conservatives talk about all the time when they say why it was necessary the U.S. had to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, saying, look, you either were going to try and invade with 100,000 men, many who would be killed, or you try and do this thing where you are going to enact some evil, but you hope that it's for, the greater good of saving American citizens in the long run. Right? That's going to be their defense of why then it was necessary to drop the bomb, saying, yeah, in both cases, it's not great. You're going to have a lot of Americans killed. In the other case, you're going to have a lot of Japanese civilians killed. And they're going to say that this was not a compromise between good and evil, but in this case, perhaps sometimes between evil and evil. Political reason is a computing principle. It involves adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, morally, and not metaphysically or mathematically true moral denominations. But politics doesn't unfold this way. And to be a virtuous, a wise political actor requires practical judgment, things that cannot be determined a priori. So here we really start to see Burke's political realism. So the overturning of ancient institutions and principles by force will hold power by the same means. Burke argues that if you think the monarch is corrupt and you want to seize power and say no one individual should have that amount of power, well, you have to have just as much power to overthrow that individual. And then if you want to remake society, then you need the same kind of power that monarch had before to remake society. Power, though, always corrupts. Humans are fallible creatures. We're subject to all kinds of emotional pulls and influences. Things like, the appeal to glory, or just maybe even power itself. To this extent, then, Burke thinks liberalism has an unrealistic conception of human nature, because liberal philosophers seem to think then that, there are these certain kinds of rights, and if we reorganize government according to those rights, then we'll maximize the way in which human beings act through self-interest. Now, not a kind of immoral self-interest that Hobbes thinks that characterizes the moral nature of human beings, but a kind of rational self-interest, right? Just looking for my own self-preservation. Human nature for Burke is intricate and society is complex, such that when I hear the simplicity of contrivance aimed at and boasted of in any new political constitutions, I am at no loss to decide that the artificers are grossly ignorant of their trade or totally negligent of their duty. He further says, you would not cure the evil by resolving that there should be no more monarchs, nor ministers of state, nor of the gospel, no interpreters of law, no general officers, no public councils. You might change the names. The things in some shape must remain. A certain quantum of power must always exist in the community, in some hands, and under some appellation. So Burke is appealing to the sentiments that he thinks guide human beings. He's influenced by the metaethical theory of sentimentalism that says that morality is derived or known from human sentiments, passions, or feelings, not from reason. So we can't simply think about what the right is or the good is, as maybe Kant or utilitarians like John Stuart Mill do. Instead, we have to appeal to the sentiments which human beings either are repelled by or drawn to, what they like or dislike. He argues that our sentiments, they naturally guide our political behavior. An example of this is the shock with which he, and he says others, had when they saw the results of the French Revolution, the beheading of the monarch. He says, why then? Why is Burke in shock at these results? Because it is natural that I should. Human nature makes us sympathetic in times of turmoil, because our passions instruct our reason, because we are so made as to be affected at such spectacles with melancholy sentiments upon the unstable condition of mortal prosperity and the tremendous uncertainty of human greatness. We are also at shock, Burke says, when we see an assassination or an attempted assassination attempt of a political leader, because the leader, ultimately really the sovereign whom the leader is a representative of, is sublime. There's this sense in the conservative tradition that government and the sovereign is something sublime. It's something that we really are in awe of, that we really can't fully wrap our hands around. It is something, the ability to govern human beings is beyond ourselves. And Burke says, we fear God. We look up with awe to kings, with affection to parliaments, with duty to magistrates, with reverence to priests, and with respect to nobility. Why? Because when such ideas are brought before our minds, it is natural to be so affected. Prejudice also is natural according to Burke, so further appealing to the sentiments. He says that prejudice is of ready application in an emergency. It's not a matter of, when we're in a situation which might call on ourselves to act to save our lives. We don't want to be thinking, should I not think this way? Am I being prejudiced? Prejudice is something natural. It is something that enables our self-preservation, because we then appeal to a kind of ready-made habit. Now, not a habit, not something we're born with, right? It's not something like an instinct. Instead, prejudice, for Burke, engages the mind in a steady course of wisdom and virtue. It takes into account how older generations think because of their experience, what they've learned, and seeks to try to determine, well, to what extent do the older generations and what they think, what their prejudices are, to what extent can we see a kind of mean between extremes here? So, prejudice renders a person's virtue their habit, and through it, one's duty becomes a part of their nature. That it is actually this appeal to maybe certain traditions and customs, and I guess we could say more generally, that is a kind of prejudice, that we actually are able to survive. We can't just reason our way in every certain circumstance, because human beings aren't robots where they can make these split-second decisions. We have to appeal to prejudice. He says, instead of casting away all our old prejudices, we cherish them to a very considerable degree. And to take more shame to ourselves, we cherish them because they are prejudices. And the longer they have lasted, and the more generally they have prevailed, the more we cherish them. That we ought to stop and think, if an institution, if a practice, if a belief has lasted for so long, maybe there's a good reason to continue practicing it, to uphold that institution and believe in that thing. Burke also appeals to natural law theory, that values and rights come from God, and that good government is that which is suited to this end according to nature. So, of course, the way in which government should be guided by is what would be divine laws, right? Divine goodness. The problem is, as human beings, we don't live in heaven. We don't have access to the divine. The best we can do is try to mirror the divine within, of course, reason, within the limits. So a good government, then, is one which will try to, as best as possible, organize society according to nature, because nature was created by God. That means when we say a government is legitimate or not, it is not according to whether or not, the government has held up its end of a bargain, as if government or society is like a contract in the way that business transactions occur. Government is like a kind of contract, but it's not a contract to other human beings. Burke says, the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco, or some other such low concern, and to be taken up for a little temporary interest, and then to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. It is to be looked on with other reverence, right? Because again, government, the state, is sublime. Each contract of each particular state is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher natures, connecting the visible and invisible world, according to a fixed compact sanctioned by the inviolable oath which holds all physical and moral nature each in their appointed place. Society is like a contract. It is not a contract between citizens and their government. It is not a contract between equals. It is a contract with God. So Burke argues, political hierarchy and religious tradition is the foundation of civilization. We cannot merely get rid of them because we find them to be arbitrary according to the arguments, the demands of reason. Burke says, the nobility and the clergy, the one by professions and the other by patronage, kept learning in existence, even in the midst of arms and confusions, and whilst governments were rather in their causes than formed, that they have a way of continuing even in turmoil, even when there is civil war, even through the Dark Ages. What continued? The clergy. He says, we know, and what is better, we feel inwardly, that religion is the basis of civil society and the source of all good and of all comfort. He also says we are resolved to keep an established church, an established monarchy, an established aristocracy, and an established democracy, only each in the degree it exists and in no greater. So if we live in a society that has had an established monarchy, we're not justified in trying to then institute a democracy. We don't have the traditions for it. If we live, though, in an established democracy, we wouldn't be justified in trying to overthrow it for, to live under a monarchy or some other system, because we wouldn't have the institutions and traditions for it. We are subject to all of that which has come before us. We cannot simply wish it away with the use of reason and political arms, because when we do, we end up undermining the very fabric of society. We hurt ourselves, which is why Burke is going to say that's why you have counter-revolutions arise, why you have people who are so afraid when they see people being beheaded by the guillotine, because they feel something isn't right about this, and they end up wishing for that which came before, even if it is the ancien regime. So Burke's conservatism is founded on the sublime deference to tradition. But I think a good question to ask is this deference to tradition arbitrary? Right? Because Burke wants to say, of course, just because something is arbitrary, we shouldn't therefore get rid of it. But of course, we're concerned with philosophy, we're concerned with the legitimacy of this political theory of conservatism, and we want to know, on what grounds then do we defer to tradition? Now, as a conservative, Burke is going to be referencing the sublimity of the sublimeness of government and the state of the social order. He's also going to be kind of making a mythological argument about government. But when we defer, I think we are right to ask, at what point do we stop? Surely there's got to be some kinds of traditions that we want to say we should not continue. And if we defer to tradition, whose tradition do we defer to, right? Because we would say there are different kinds of traditions throughout the world. Would we just say, well, look, each one of them is right for them? Does that mean we end up falling into a kind of relativism? Or would we say, no, our tradition is the right tradition? But if it is the right tradition, on what ground can we say so? And I want to read a quote from Mary Wollstonecraft in her A Vindication of the Rights of Men when she is criticizing Burke on exactly this line of questioning. She says, "Are we to seek for the rights of men in the ages when a few marks were the only penalty imposed for the life of a man, and death for death when the property of the rich was touched? Were the rights of men understood when the law authorized or tolerated murder? Or is power and right the same in your creed?" She's asking Burke. "But in fact, all your declamation leads so directly to this conclusion that I beseech you to ask your own heart, when you call yourself a friend of liberty, whether it would not be more consistent to style yourself the champion of property, the adorer of the golden image which power has set up." So is Burke's real, is what he's championing, is it really the right of liberty or the right of property? She says there is no end to this implicit submission to authority. Somewhere it must stop, or we return to barbarism, upon which societies were originally founded. So again, I'll ask, is this deference to tradition arbitrary? When we defer, at what point do we stop, and whose tradition do we defer to?